Michael Ondaatje's Booker Prize-winning novel, The English Patient, won critical acclaim and a very intensely loyal following. Among them, director Anthony Minghella. This was a story he had to bring to film. It has been released and is winning rave reviews. New Yorker film critic Anthony Lane called The English Patient awfully close to a masterpiece. The film stars Ralph Fiennes, Juliette Binoche, Kristen Scott Thomas, and Willem Dafoe. Joining me now, author Michael Ondaatje and director Anthony Minghella. I am enormously happy to have you here. I love the movie. People know that because we've talked about it before. I want to first talk about the book itself. What did you set out to create in writing this book? What was this to be about? What were the grand themes that you wanted to explore?
Well, the trouble is when I begin a book, I don't have the grand themes in my head at all. I have to kind of discover them.
The characters?
I have a couple of incidents, like the plane crash or the idea of a patient and a nurse at night talking. Those were the two images I had in my head.
So it starts with images in this case.
Yeah. And then the characters in those images, like who is the man in the plane, why is he there, why does it crash, what year this is. And then with those little fragments of mosaics, they build up and you start finding out the past of the characters and trying to invent a past for those characters.
How do you do that?
Well, I do it by just staying with those images for about 4 or 5 years and just waiting until they build up very, very slowly. And then those images meet up with other images and new characters come in.
You won the Booker Prize in 1992.
Right.
Book released in 1991.
No, actually it came out in 1992.
In 92. Yep. And it was in your head for what, for 6 or 7 years?
Yeah.
Before you got down and wrote it.
No, it came to my head as I started to write it. I mean, I didn't have any plans before I sat down to write it. So I began about 1986 and it took about 5 years to write it.
Now that you've written it, what's it about?
Well, I think it becomes a kind of crucible of many love stories set in a time of war. And
love for place and love for person as well.
Love for person mostly. And I think one of the things Anthony has done with the film is emphasize that love, which is not just a male-female love, but the love of friends and the dangers of love of country. You know, so I think that has certainly stayed there. But what drives me when I'm writing the book is this collection of characters and just being utterly curious about these characters.
When did they come together in the villa for you?
Right at the beginning. I knew it was going to take place in this abandoned villa in Italy in 1945.
So you knew time and place?
I knew time and place.
Yeah.
And then the desert was more of a mystery. Why was it taking place in the desert as well? And what was interesting to me about Italy at that time was when the Germans retreated, they left behind all these bombs on everywhere, so the Americans and the English couldn't advance rapidly at any great speed. So that treacherous bomb danger alongside Renaissance art in Italy seemed like this strange metaphor.
You do a lot of research.
Not as much as it seems, perhaps. Anthony's caught me on all this.
Did he? All right, let me see. The book arrives, or at least the manuscript, the galleys, the book.
Oh, yes.
The book.
I bought the book in a bookstore up the road from here.
Is that right? And you went home?
I went home. I'd been filming in New York, and it was my first day off, and I got up in the morning, and I opened the book, and when I finished the book, it was dark. And I completely was intoxicated by it. I'd read everything Michael had written beforehand. Yeah. It was my excuse of getting to know him to get involved in this book. And I love the book, and it's an extraordinarily rich well of material for a filmmaker. I mean, I fell into it, and I took about 3.5 years to clamber out.
It's about love. It's about betrayal. It's about identity. You know, it's about larger themes in terms of the war place. It's also about very small personal stories, the kind of thing you like.
Well, I think what interests me is, you know, the thing that film does wonderfully, I think, is that it can go from a tiny place on a woman's neck, it can go with some compulsion about a tiny piece of physical geography, of a body's geography, and in a cut it can go to this huge landscape of the desert. And Michael's book is doing that all the time. It's constantly cutting from tiny idea to big idea. And it says something about history, because I think that's what history is. History is this cut between the demands of personal behavior, personal intrigue, loyalties, those things. It shows you that history is not something going on outside of the window. It's those things which count. And so because film can insist on the relationship between this public landscape and this tiny personal one, that this book, it lends itself in a peculiar way to adaptation. In other ways, it drove all of us crazy, you know.
In what way did it lend itself to adaptation, and in what way did it drive you crazy?
Well, I think the richness. You know, somebody said about, Michael will know this novelist, who said that, you know, the Eskimos have 50 words for snow, we should have 50 for love.
Yes.
And in a way, in the book, there are so many types of love examined. Not only, you know, when you say this film is romantic, I always get nervous because I think it's not the romance of chocolate box and tenderness and sweetness. And a lot of the love in the film is coruscating, difficult, painful, damaging, tragic.
Yeah.
And so I thought that rosary of potential love stories, of the difference, of the compulsion of love for the desert, the intrigue of loving one person then trampling over somebody else, the love of friends. Friendship plays an enormous part in the film. The richness of that could end up being an extraordinary, you know, enthralling journey in a film. On the other hand, the part of Michael's book, the beauty of it is in its language. The prose is exquisite. And film is not exquisite in its prose. It can't be. It's much more mechanical and architectural.
It can't be.
I don't think that it can rely on language to carry the day. It has to rely on something
visual and sweeping.
And also, it's a deconstructed story. You know, on one page in Michael's book, if you picked any page now, it would go from a meditation on winds to this historical discussion about what Herodotus was. You often don't know who's speaking in the book. And so film has this obligation, I think, to tell a story. And often when I was working on the screenplay, I felt as though I was reconstructing the book rather than deconstructing. I was trying to write my way towards what was a story. Whereas Michael, the joy of reading Michael's book, I think, is in trying to piece these shards together in all different kinds of patterns.
Did you like, this is obvious, the adaptation, the film adaptation of your book?
Oh, I loved it.
It met what you wanted 100%.
Yes, I think what was, for me, really wonderful was that it was completely different from the book. I mean, or not completely different, but it wasn't something handcuffed to the book. It wasn't an illustration of the book. So that, you know, when I saw the first draft, any worries I had, not so much about the book being betrayed or anything, but just worrying about how Anthony was going to make this film. When I saw that first draft, it was different, and so it was something that the three of us, Saul and Anthony and myself, could almost look at and study as if it was something completely new. It was a new invention.
And was there any kind of collaboration here?
Oh, constant collaboration. I mean, one thing about Michael's book is, of course, that what you can do if you're a novelist is that you can write a single line, and with that one line you can evoke a time or a period. This is why it looks like Michael's researched so hard, because he's so clever at sort of encapsulating the smell of Cairo, or this idea of what the desert might be like, or a sense of a villa in Italy at the end of the war. If you're a filmmaker, it's so prosaic. If you don't put something in front of the lens, you don't see anything. And so I had to go away and I had to do the research and the history and try and teach myself about areas I was so stupid and ignorant of. And then what enabled me to move on was to come back with that research material and then test it out on Michael. And I think, you know, there's many advantages of being a writer-director on a film. You can direct from the first day of writing, and you can write at the last day of directing. I was still writing up until the last minute. The disadvantage is that, you know, normally there's a very interesting and healthy friction between the writer of the screenplay and the director. And in that tension, often you can generate wonderful things. And what I managed to do was to persuade Michael to come in and, in a way, sit between the screenplay and me as a filmmaker, and with Saul there as well, Saul's answer producer. And that generated the friction which made the film better, I think.
The love scenes between Catherine and Almaché are not, you put them in there, not in the book.
Well, we've got to the point, and I don't mean this in any sort of dissembling way, where neither of us can quite recall where the material came from, whether it was in the book or whether we invented it for the film. I mean, I imagined those scenes when I was reading the book. So everything I've added, I think, is only the addition of what you do as a reader, which is you fill in what isn't in the prose.
The opening scene is the plane. Yeah, that was easy for you, was it not?
Listen, I tell you, when I had the screenplay, I was so pleased finally to get the film made, because we had so many problems making the film. When I got there and I looked at the screenplay and I thought, well, how do you direct this film? It's every day it seemed like some new gymnastic exercise for a filmmaker. You know, crash a plane at a man, make a sandstorm, fly a plane. I mean, every day it was I was at the edge of my ability.
But the desert and the contours of a woman's body and all that is...
Well, I felt that was the one line that stayed throughout the 2,000 drafts of the screenplay, was a sense I had that if you could make the geography erotic, if you could make the sensuality of the physical terms of the film be as erotic as possible, then you could really make a very interesting love story.
Tell me about the obsession of this character for this married woman. This obsessive love. He doesn't seem, at first, to be a natural, to be obsessed.
Well, that was a line in the book, which is not in the film, which actually, where he says at some point, I'm a man who fasts until I see what I want. And in a way, that's, for me, always behind that character. You know, he is a stick, you know. I mean, he can be quite impossible to his friends, but I mean, I think he is someone who is one of those very spare people. And when I was doing research on the desert and explorers, that was what I loved about them. They were these laconic people who didn't really romanticize the desert. They didn't talk about sunsets. They didn't complain about the heat.
It was a job.
It was a job. To get from here to here, there are 7 wells, and you follow those 7 wells, and that's how you get there. And it was that kind of personality, I think, that Anthony wrote in the film, and Rafe acted out quite wonderfully.
Yeah. Boy, the casting of this thing is perfect.
Yeah.
It's perfect in retrospect, I hope, but when we were actually doing it, it cost us dearly, because I think that Saul, he's a great enabler, Saul Zaentz.
Yes, he's a producer.
He's the producer, and he's a man who makes you feel like you can do anything. And so he encouraged me to cast the film in exactly the way I wanted, and we did that, and then nobody wanted us.
No.
You know, because we wanted to cast actors rather than film stars, I think.
Yeah, and the story is that 20th Century Fox wanted a film star. And without, you know, I mean, Demi Moore and whoever else might have been on that list, and probably a many. You didn't want a film star. You wanted an actress for this.
My want, it's rather like Michael and his novel. I didn't know what I wanted. I wanted to find who I wanted. And I don't have any rancor towards Fox. I think, in some ways, I think it's extraordinary that anybody gives anybody any money to make films. I mean, you know, if you're Michael Ondaatje and you want to write a novel, you need some paper and a pen, and you can do your job. If I want to do this film, I need a camera and $30 million. And given that this film is so full of difficult ideas, a man is in a bed, it's set in the war, it's set in Europe, you know, it's a memory film. I'm not surprised that anybody felt nervous, and I think we didn't do anything on our parts to persuade people that we were going to deliver the insurance policies. And in fact, we were just very lucky that Miramax and Harvey Weinstein and Bob Weinstein
They came in after 20th Century, backed out, having spent...
We backed away from them, I think, in the end. I mean, I think we deserved everything we got, and we were just very lucky.
But you had to shut down production.
We had to shut. It was awful. Yeah. I mean, we were in Rome. We'd built sets. We had the actors there. We had 100 people working, and it was falling apart around me. And that was a really desperate time. And I think it's made the victory of making the film all the more sweet for us.
It's funny, I was thinking that very phrase. Roll tape. This is a scene in which Almasi comes in to the banquet, and you see the obsessive love that he has for Catherine. Take a look. That's obsession, isn't it?
It is, yes.
When you were making this film, did you have a feeling, I mean, you talked about all the problems you had, I mean, but once you got back and Harvey Weinstein and Miramax came in and put you back on course, did it feel good? Was there a sense that it was working, that you were on your way to what some people are now calling a masterpiece?
Oh, no, I mean, I just was about survival. I mean, the desert is the most inhospitable place to make a film. And we had the money of a low-budget production which shot for months and months and months. We had it was a glue and bits of string filmmaking. And so we were just struggling to survive. I broke my ankle, which is a very daft thing to do, you know, with a film like this to make. And we were galvanized. That's what happened. We became crusaders in a way. Everybody. We all were so thrilled to be allowed to make the film that it certainly gave a team spirit, which I think carried us through some dog days.
And I think all the actors, too, you had a sense for the actors kind of being dedicated on the project.
What is it about this story, in a book, in a film, that connects?
Well, I think, you know, I wrote a book that I suppose it's the most intimate thing I can write. And I think in that sense, what I love about the film is that it is also intimate. You know, it has the same kind of intimacy. It may be it may be an epic, but it's sort of a very intimate epic. And I think in that sense, we are so unused to that in film. We see the kind of the vast, you know, panorama of history, and that's all we usually see in film. We don't see an intimate version of it.
That's exactly what you liked.
But it's also, I mean, Michael speaks too modestly of the book. The book is ravishing and extraordinary, and you fall into it. And I think that's its quality. It is this quality of being able to make history seem fascinating. you know, to make people's behavior seem so dynamic and gorgeous. And I think that I saw the possibility of a film that could be ravishing to look at and still keep people and humanity right in the middle of a frame. And anyway, everybody's been damaged. Everybody's been damaged in love. Everybody's been healed by love. And I think it's that duality. I mean, what's interesting to me about the film is that it says, you know, Hollywood tends to be attracted to stories which have a moral certainty. Everything's very clear. The map is clear of how people, good guys, bad guys. And this story is all about the complexities of morality. It's about the fact that loving your country means that somebody, you know, that winning something in war means somebody is losing. There's always somebody's hostage to your sense of moral rectitude. And I think the book concerns itself with that, and we've tried to make a film in that way.
One more piece about the love story. Here it is. Roll tape. One of the things that's interesting, if people who've read the book and then go see the movie, because the movie's about 2 hours and 39 minutes, right, if I remember, you forget what might have been in the book and what's in the movie. For example, there's a relationship in the book between Caravaggio and Hannah's family.
Right.
From a previous book, right?
Right. Hannah and Caravaggio appeared in an earlier book called In the Skin of a Lion. But I think one of the things Anthony pointed out to me was that the coincidence rate was pretty high, that Caravaggio would come to this monastery and to meet Hannah, and there happens to be in the same monastery being looked after by the man that he's been looking for. So what can work in a book because of the history of the characters, in a film, a short film, you can't really get away with that.
Also, in that story of Caravaggio, I felt you needed some energy to come into this film of somebody who wanted something desperately. And also, he's like an early example of the catastrophe theory to me in the film. Is he's somebody, a terrible thing has happened to him, an awful mutilation. And in fact, I tried to put it in the film in the most...
looked away.
In the most graphic way for a reason, not because I'm as timid and as worried about those things as anybody else is, but it seems to me that the story of this century has been the fact that people have had terrible things done to them, atrocities visited upon them, and because they won't let go of those real atrocities, and they have every justification for not letting go, but because they won't let go, history can't resolve itself. People can't move on because people are trapped with the bitterness, which is, you know, a just bitterness. But unless they can move on, we can't sort ourselves out. And this part of the century
can't continue unless they can move on with some memory, but move on.
Yeah, tribalism is killing us. And I suppose this is what the film and Michael's book is saying, is that we can't hold on to the past in the way that this character of Caravaggio does in the film. And in fact, what happens to him is I try to set up a situation where he runs into a room, essentially, and says, I found you, and the guy's lying on the bed, and the thing he most wants is for somebody to put a gun to his head. Yeah. And the absurdity of hanging on, you know, I think is what comes out, the absurdity of that.
In the end, does Caravaggio know who betrayed him in the film?
I think so. I think it becomes irrelevant. He says he says something, he turns on the English patient at one point and says, because of what you did, thousands of people could have died. And the patient says, well, thousands of people did die, just different people. And I think what I try to say is look at the value of human life. It doesn't have anything to do with color or creed or nationality or loyalty. It just is there. And so I tried to make it irrelevant who had betrayed him.
Roll tape. This is a scene in where Caravaggio, played well by Willem Dafoe, asked Juliette Binoche, who plays Hannah, if she loves Ralph Fiennes. Here it is. Tell me about that scene.
Well, I think what was ironic to me, and this is one of the beauties of the book, and we try to capture it in the film, is that for all this sense of we understand it's a global village, we're insisting on Europe rather than Britain, we're trying to embrace all of to become civilians of the world. Of course, I'm the most tribal person around, and when we were in Berkeley cutting the film, Michael would tease me because I'd get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to drive into San Francisco to watch England play in the European soccer tournament. and I think that's the other thing I tried to play on, was the humor of the fact that we all have these aspirations, but they're constantly knocked by our own tribalism. But we are small, and then we're comforted and solaced by our nationality, just as much as we know that sometimes it betrays us.
Speaking of that, you were born in Sri Lanka.
Right.
Yes. You went to Canada to be educated. You consider yourself Canadian. You have a Canadian what?
Half my head is Canadian, the other half is Sri Lankan still. You know, I mean, I'm a complete mongrel, as Anthony is. You know, and
mongrel too, Anthony.
Both mongrels.
Both mongrels.
Mongrels flock together.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think we both have the same sense of because Michael was educated in England, so was I. My parents are Italian. I think we both have this strange attitude towards England and Englishness. And I think one of the plays in the film is about what is English, what it means to be English. And I think I'm as drawn to England and as terrified of it as Michael is.
Drawn to it and terrified, why?
Because it's not something, it's hard to be assimilated in England, in a way that here everybody's a mongrel.
It's
and
not
they celebrate.
egalitarian?
It isn't. I mean, it's a wonderful place, and I think of it as my home. But I've always felt, my parents used to call the English l'inglese, and that's what I've always thought. And in fact, Kristen and Ray are perfect examples. They're sort of people who cut them open. They have a Union Jack flying in the middle. And I was as
Kristen also lives in France.
She lives in France. But there's something quite terrifying in the certainty and history that I don't think I feel, I don't think Michael feels.
Speaking of performance, who gave you the most unexpected performance?
Kristen, I think. I mean, Juliette Binoche, I think, is my favorite actress in the world. Juliette Stevenson and Juliette Binoche, I think, are the two people I hold in my... hold. And Juliette has this quality, she's like this, whatever she's feeling, you can see right through her. There's no mediation between this inner being and her heart and what she shows you. And it's a wonderful experience to be around that. Kristen is completely opposite in every sense. You never know quite what's happening. You never know what she's thinking. You never know what she's feeling. And also, we fought for her, and at the same time, the more you fight, the more nervous you get that your judgment is, corrupt or absurd in some way. And to see what...
What do you mean? You fought with the studios who said you need a big star?
Yeah, exactly. And it was a gamble to cast her. She hadn't done, she hadn't
carried. And what did you know that made you so sure in the beginning that made you fight for her?
Nothing. It's entirely unscientific process. I just felt she was the right person.
All right, we'll show in a minute. This is a place where we'll introduce you to Kip. Tell me who Kip is in the novel, and we'll know who he is in the film.
Kip is a Sikh,
he's
a sapper,
Sikh,
and
right.
he works for the British Army, part of the British Army, and he's there to dismantle the bombs that
the Nazis are fleeing,
yes.
and this is in Tuscany, and
right.
and there's still bombs they've left.
And he has become enamored of everything English before he gets to the villa.
And he loves jazz.
Loves jazz and
now,
loves music.
Where did that touch come from?
I have a Sikh friend who loves jazz. I think it was quite simple. And I love jazz. I mean, I think a lot of your parts of yourself and parts of your friends sneak into books as well.
Did you have to go learn how to dismantle a bomb in order to write that?
I wouldn't rely on the book to find out how to dismantle a bomb.
Of course not, but you had to at least make it believable.
Yeah. I made it believable, but I did read a lot of stuff about Second World War bomb disposal.
And what's the love between the two of them, between Hannah and Kip?
It's a much more tentative love than the love between
Kristen
Almazi and Catherine, because I think, in some odd way, though they are much younger, or they are younger, they are much more wary. They've both been through a kind of a war, and as a lot of young people today are, much less emotional in some odd way than an older person.
And the favorite line of hers is, "Everybody she loves dies."
Yeah. Well, that's Anthony, actually. That's Anthony needing
you gave that line.
It's an angle.
Well,
it's a movie line.
I'm sorry. No, I wanted to make it clear that she felt as if she'd been cursed. Because in a way, it's her I think what happens in war is that superstitions, hold the day.
And that drives her to the villa.
Drives her to the villa, which became a monastery in the film, because I wanted to literally make it into a retreat, a place of refuge. And then I wanted to say, no, that isn't the case. The people are not cursed. The people can move on. And one of the things that I tried to say, look, it is a tragedy, this film. It's incredibly tragic what happens to these people. But it's not nihilistic. It's about the spirit being able to survive. And I always had this idea the film would end in light, that Hannah would move on. And so in order to do that, I needed to insist on the idea of cursing at the beginning. So
roll tape. Here it is, and you'll see Kip and Hannah together at the monastery. Yeah. I would love for the audience to know as we're watching that, you said what? I love what?
Well, I love Naveen in this film, and Naveen, who plays Kip, he's just wonderful. And there's a little small bit there at the end of that scene when Hardy comes and says, "Lieutenant," and you turn around and he says, "Sergeant," something like that, and you just realize that he's the officer and Hardy's under him, and that lovely relationship between him and Hardy that happens. That's the setup right there.
What is Herodotus about? I mean, why there? What's his place in this story?
Well, when I was doing research, my little bit of research, there was one of the early map makers said of one expedition. I was in charge of the expedition, and I was in charge of the library, and our library was just one book, Herodotus, and which was a lovely idea that all these explorers in the 1930s were still using the one historical text from way back when, which was also about the same landscape in a way, and they were using that as a kind of referential point several generations later.
What are Alsame's fears as he is lying there?
Well, I think he's in a room crowded with his ghosts. And I think, in a way, Willem says to me at one point, have you forgotten, or do you just choose not to remember?
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that, to me, the whole energy of the film was about exercising those ghosts. It's about finally confronting the ghosts. And it's funny, I used Michael's book in a way in the film. I said it's not Herodotus, it's the English patient novel that he has lying there, because everything is in the book. And it shows you what I'm like as opposed to what Michael's like. I kept thinking about Pinocchio and Jiminy Cricket opening the book at the beginning. Everything is in the book, and it all falls to the floor, these letters, these cuttings, these meditations. And if you can only look at these documents, you can solve the puzzle of the film. Because I wanted the film to be a puzzle as well as anything else.
Why does Catherine love him?
I don't know.
That's a question that if you could answer, the world would change immediately. And I think there's something inexorable about the feeling they have for each other. There's something about claiming somebody who's so much inside his own shell. I mean, they're both like crabs in a way to me in the film. They both don't know how to be. They're cut from the same cloth, I think, and they resist their feeling as much as they embrace it. I wanted the film
They want it but don't want it.
Yeah, I wanted the first time they get together not to be falling into each other's arms, but to actually be a blow, because they're boiling. That's what I feel all the way. There's a sort of lava in them.
I saved this scene for the end. I don't want to give it away, but this is a powerful scene. Take a look at this. This is where there is, in fact, a moment in which Alsame finds her and takes her to a cave, and parting words. Here it is. Actually, she knew that, and she believed that at that moment, and he did. Mm-hmm. You're knocked out by his performance.
I think it's one of the most selfless performances in some way.
Selfless.
Yes, I think it's not a kind of an aria of a leading man. It's such a carefully drawn portrait of a person with all the variations of tenderness within that kind of cold exterior, and I think it's a beautiful performance.
When I first saw the book, it looked like this, The English Patient. And it had a little thing on it that said soon to be a major motion picture. It is now a major motion picture, and everybody is talking about it. There is not a film out that has gotten better reviews than The English Patient. In fact, as we noticed, Anthony Lake says it's a masterpiece, or as close to a masterpiece as you get. Here is what the book looks like now. Guess whose faces are on there? There is Ralph Fiennes and, what's her name, Kristen Scott Thomas. It's a pleasure to meet you, Michael.
Thank you.
People are now wanting to go back and read the book because of this movie. You, sir, have done an extraordinary job.
Thank you so much.
Very much. We'll be right back. Stay with us.